The millionaire's baby hadn't slept in days. His cries echoed through the halls of the mansion, piercing every wall, every silence. Nurses, doctors, even specialists failed to soothe him. Until one night, a woman no one noticed, hired just to clean floors, walked into the nursery and sang. In that instant, the child went quiet. But what seemed like instinct revealed a secret buried deep within the family's past, one that would shake their legacy and expose a truth no one was ready to face. What happened next? No one could have imagined. If this story touches you, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share in the comments. Where in the world are you listening from? Your support is what keeps this channel alive. In the heart of Texas, nestled between the tall pines and white-fenced meadows, the Winters estate rose like a modern fortress, majestic, cold, and far too quiet for a house with a newborn. Built of stone and pride, it was the kind of mansion that made people lower their voices as they approached. Inside, every object gleamed with polish, and every hallway smelled of imported lilies and money. But behind all that luxury, something was wrong, very wrong. Baby Liam hadn't stopped crying in days. He was 4 months old, soft-cheeked and delicate, yet his screams had begun to feel like the cries of something older, something ancient. No one could soothe him. Not the round-the-clock nurses with decades of experience, not the pediatrician flown in from New York, not the lactation consultants, the sleep trainers, the whispering grandmothers. Nothing worked. The house, once a place of polished dinners and boardroom meetings, now echoed with despair. Curtains remained closed. Light barely entered the nursery. The air inside was thick with anxiety. Everyone walked on tiptoe, as if afraid the floor itself might shatter. And then, without warning, one of the nurses quit. She had lasted only 7 hours. "I'm sorry," she whispered, eyes hollow. "I don't know what he needs, but I know it's not me." Jonathan Winters stood at the edge of the hallway, jaw clenched, shoulders heavy. The richest man under 50 in Texas and heir to the Winters oil legacy, he had made empires move with a phone call. But this was beyond his reach. He watched his son writhe and sob in his crib and felt something foreign and terrifying, helplessness. Meanwhile, on the other side of the house, Natalie Carter wiped sweat from her brow. She stood in the laundry room, elbow deep in a pile of monogrammed linens. She'd only been working at the estate for 3 weeks, hired in a hurry, placed by a temp agency no one remembered calling. She kept her head down, her words few, her presence invisible. No one had asked her anything since she arrived, not even her name. But Natalie noticed everything. She noticed how the house seemed to breathe differently each day, heavier. She noticed how even the birds stopped singing near the nursery. And more than anything, she noticed the sound of the baby's cry. It wasn't the sharp, angry wail of a child wanting milk or sleep. No, it was something else, something aching. She felt it in her bones. On the 5th night, close to midnight, she could no longer bear it. The halls were nearly empty. The house lights dimmed to a low, golden glow. A storm rumbled quietly in the distance, and the windows trembled now and then from the wind. No one saw her when she laid her towel down and stepped out of the laundry room. She moved with a quiet certainty through the corridors, like someone following a thread only she could see. When Natalie reached the nursery, the cries were sharp and desperate. The nurse on duty sat frozen, shoulders slumped, whispering over and over, "I don't know what else to do." Liam lay in his crib, red-faced, fists clenched so tightly they left crescents in his skin. His tiny body was arching, resisting comfort, as if protesting something no one understood. Natalie crossed the threshold. She didn't ask permission. She didn't speak. She walked straight to the crib, leaned over, and with a tenderness that seemed born of instinct, lifted the baby into her arms. Her hands were steady, her breath calm. She pressed him gently against her chest, just above her heart, and began to hum. It wasn't a song from the radio or a lullaby taught in school. It was older than that, wordless, haunting, a melody stitched from memory and silence. Her voice was low, soft, almost like wind moving through pine needles, the kind of sound that wasn't just heard, but felt. And slowly, impossibly, the crying stopped. Liam's body relaxed, his fists opened. His sobs turned into soft hiccups, then sighs, and finally, sleep. The nurse gasped. A glass fell from her hand and shattered on the floor, but the baby didn't stir. Jonathan appeared in the doorway, drawn by the sudden quiet. He froze. Natalie didn't see him at first. She was still humming, rocking Liam gently, her eyes closed as if lost in the song. But Jonathan heard it, every note, and a chill ran down his spine, not of fear, but recognition. Because that melody, it was the same lullaby his mother used to sing to him. He hadn't heard it in over 25 years. It had never been written down, never recorded, just a soft tune she used to invent on the spot, a melody he thought had died with her. His voice broke the silence. "Where did you learn that?" Natalie turned slowly. She looked at him with calm, unwavering eyes. "I don't know," she said gently. "I grew up in a few orphanages. One of the older girls used to hum it when we were scared. They said no one knew where it came from. I just remembered." Jonathan stared at her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound in the room was Liam's breathing, soft and steady against her shoulder. Natalie finally placed him back into the crib, tucking the blue blanket around his tiny body. He didn't stir. His face, so often twisted with exhaustion, was now serene, as if he had finally come home. She turned to leave, but Jonathan took a step forward. "Wait," she paused, not turning around. "Just stay," he said. "Please." The air between them pulsed with something invisible. Recognition, echoes, a thread neither of them understood but both felt. Natalie didn't nod. She didn't smile. She just stood there. And in that moment, something ancient stirred in the walls of the Winters estate, something unspoken. Because that lullaby wasn't just a song, it was a signal, and someone had just answered it. The next morning, the silence in the Winters mansion felt different. Not the cold, hollow kind that came from despair, but something gentler, something like rest. For the first time in nearly a week, Liam was sleeping soundly in his crib. No more raw-throated screams, no flinching from staff, no pacing footsteps in the halls, only the soft breath of a child who had finally surrendered to peace. Jonathan stood by the doorway, coffee untouched in his hand, watching his son as if seeing him for the first time. The baby's cheeks were rosy again, his eyelids fluttering slightly in dream. And Jonathan couldn't stop hearing that melody. It had played in his mind all night long. His mother used to sing it when he was sick, when he broke his arm at 8, when he hid under the bed the day his father slammed a door too hard. She would hum it in the dark, just those same few notes, always in the same rhythm. He had tried to remember it many times in the years since her passing, but it always escaped him, like water through fingers. Until now. Natalie had sung it perfectly. But how? He didn't speak to her that morning. He passed her once in the corridor, her hands carrying a tray of folded towels, and their eyes met briefly. She said nothing, neither did he, but something passed between them, a current, a weight. Later that day, after making sure Rachel was out of the house visiting her parents, Jonathan returned to his private study. The room was dim and cluttered with old books, wooden shelves, and framed photographs of family members who rarely smiled. It smelled faintly of leather, tobacco, and something older, something like memory. He unlocked the lower drawer of his desk and pulled out a box lined with red velvet. Inside were a few of his mother's belongings, a brooch she always wore, a postcard from Paris, and a battered cassette tape with no label. He placed the tape into an old recorder and hit play. The sound was fuzzy, But then, clear as light, a voice came through, her voice. "Lullaby for my boy," she whispered. And then the song began. The same one Natalie had sung. Jonathan froze. His hand trembled. This wasn't a coincidence. That afternoon, he waited by the back gardens, where Natalie often hung laundry to dry. The scent of fabric softener and fresh air surrounded them. When she appeared, he spoke her name, gently, without accusation. She turned to face him, quiet but unafraid. "That song," he began, hands in his pockets. "It's not something anyone else should know. My mother made it up. She used to sing it just for me. No one else ever heard it." Natalie didn't look surprised. She only nodded slightly, as if she too had known all along that this moment would come. "I heard it once," she said softly. "When I was 7, I was living in a foster home outside Austin. There was an older woman, kind but sickly, who would volunteer there. She used to hum it when she brushed our hair, said she made it up for a little girl she once wanted to adopt." Jonathan felt a strange tightness in his chest. "What was her name?" "I don't know," Natalie whispered. "But she had your eyes." The wind moved between them, lifting the edge of the laundry like hands folding into prayer. Jonathan blinked, trying to make sense of what he was hearing. Could it be possible? "She was going to adopt me," Natalie added, her voice shaking slightly. "She told me that once. I didn't believe her at the time. I thought it was just something people said to kids to make them feel less unwanted. But then she stopped coming. They told me she passed away. Heart attack, I think." He stared at her, stunned. "My mother," he said slowly, "died of a stroke at 58. She collapsed at a women's shelter she visited every Thursday." Natalie looked down. Her hands clutched the laundry basket a little tighter. Maybe it was the same place. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The past hovered between them like smoke, ungraspable but everywhere. Jonathan ran a hand through his hair. His entire body felt off-kilter, like the ground had quietly shifted beneath him. "Do you have any memory of her?" he asked finally. "Anything else?" Natalie hesitated. Then quietly, she set the basket down and reached into her pocket. She pulled out a tiny, yellowed paper, a photograph folded so many times it was nearly torn. She unfolded it carefully and handed it to him. It was a faded image of a woman, Jonathan's mother, smiling while holding the hand of a thin, wide-eyed girl with messy hair. Natalie. He recognized the necklace his mother wore in the picture. It was the same one in the box upstairs. "I've kept it all these years," she said, barely above a whisper. "I didn't know her name. I didn't even know she had a son. But I never forgot her face, or her voice, or that song." Jonathan's hands shook as he held the photo. His throat tightened. This wasn't just a story anymore. It was a connection, a thread that had frayed, almost snapped, but now returned. Natalie watched him, eyes full of something she refused to name. "I didn't come here to find you," she said. "I didn't know. But when I heard your son crying, something in me woke up." Jonathan swallowed hard. "You calmed him like no one else could." "I wasn't calming him," she said, voice low. "I was listening, and that word, listening, struck him deeper than anything else." He looked at her then, really looked, not as a cleaner, not as a stranger, but as something else. A keeper of memory, a thread in the story of his own bloodline, a ghost who never left, and a survivor who somehow returned. From that moment forward, he couldn't stop watching her. In the small moments, the silences, the way she looked at Liam, not with duty, but with reverence, as if every breath the baby took was sacred. Rachel didn't notice, or maybe she refused to. But something had changed, and deep inside Jonathan, the question began to take shape. What if Natalie wasn't here by accident at all? What if she was the last promise his mother never got to keep? The rain began that evening, soft at first, just a mist brushing against the windows of the Winters estate. By nightfall, it turned into a steady rhythm, as if the sky itself were trying to soothe something unresolved within the walls of the house. Jonathan couldn't sleep. He sat alone in his study, surrounded by quiet luxury that now felt more like a cage. The old photograph Natalie had shown him earlier that day sat on the desk before him. He had looked at it at least 100 times, trying to see more in the blurred expressions, the curve of his mother's smile, the fragile grip she had on the little girl's hand. A part of him wanted to believe it was a coincidence, a look-alike, a fluke, but deep down, he knew better. Too much lined up. The lullaby, the foster home, the necklace, the eyes, and that girl, Natalie, was standing in his house now, holding his child like he never could, singing to him with a voice that once belonged to his mother's hope. At around 2 a.m., Jonathan gave up on sleep and walked to the hallway. The house was hushed, bathed in the blue of security lights and distant lightning. The scent of chamomile and rain hung in the air. He passed Liam's room, paused at the door, and looked in. There she was, Natalie. Not asleep, not dozing, but sitting in the rocking chair beside the crib, holding an old photo album in her lap. The glow of a nightlight illuminated her face. She didn't notice him standing there. Or maybe she did and chose not to look. Jonathan stepped inside. She looked up slowly, her eyes soft but alert. "I found this tucked behind the bookshelf," she said. Her fingers traced the edge of the leather-bound album. "I thought maybe it was meant to be found." Jonathan hesitated, then nodded. He pulled a chair closer and sat beside her. For a moment they didn't speak. Only the sound of distant thunder filled the space. Natalie turned the page. The photograph that stared up at them was faded, worn around the edges. It showed a much younger Jonathan, barely 5 years old, standing on the front steps of the estate with his mother. She was kneeling, smiling at him, her hand on his shoulder. But what caught his eye was the background. To the left, partially cropped from the frame, stood another woman, a teenager, maybe 19, holding a baby. Natalie's voice was barely a whisper. "That's my mother." Jonathan's breath caught. He leaned closer. "She worked here," Natalie continued. "For a while before I was taken away." Jonathan's head spun. "Taken?" "My mother wasn't married. She was undocumented. When she got sick, she refused to go to the hospital, said she didn't want to be found. One night, she collapsed in the kitchen of the group home where we were staying." Natalie's eyes darkened with the memory. "They took me that night, told me she had passed. I didn't even get to say goodbye." Silence fell between them like a curtain. "She worked here," Jonathan repeated. "In this house." Natalie nodded. "Your mother took her in, gave her shelter, promised to help us. She even started the paperwork to adopt me when my mother got too weak to care for me. But then, everything stopped. I was moved, separated. I never knew why." Jonathan swallowed hard. His mind was a storm of recollections. He remembered vague conversations, the way his mother had stopped attending charity events, how she'd withdrawn in her final months. He had been told it was her health declining. But what if it was more? "She never told me," he said, voice thick. "She was sick. She didn't want me to worry." Natalie turned another page. This one showed the estate's garden, long before the renovations. In the far background, beneath a tree, 2 women sat on a bench, his mother and the same teenage girl from before. The baby in her arms was clearly Natalie. "I've spent most of my life wondering if I imagined her kindness," Natalie said. "If maybe I made her up in my mind to survive." "You didn't," Jonathan said. His voice cracked. "You didn't imagine her." He reached into the drawer of a nearby cabinet and pulled out something small, the cassette tape with his mother's voice. He handed it to Natalie. "She recorded this when I was a boy. It's the only recording of her singing that lullaby." Natalie took the tape as if it were made of glass. She turned it over in her hand, reverently. "There's something else," Jonathan said. He stood and crossed to the fireplace, where an ornate portrait of his great-grandfather hung. He pushed the frame aside, revealing a small wall safe. After typing the code, he opened it and pulled out a sealed envelope. "This was addressed to me," he said. "But I never opened it. I found it after she died and I couldn't. Until now." His hands trembled as he broke the seal. The letter was written in delicate cursive, the ink slightly smudged at the edges. He read it aloud, voice uneven. "My dearest Jonathan, if you are reading this, I have left something unfinished in this world. Her name is Natalie. I met her and her mother when I least expected to rediscover love and purpose. I had hoped to bring them into our family, to make them feel safe. Natalie is strong. She listens. She sees people the way I wish I had been seen as a child. If you ever find her, do not turn away. She is the bridge between who I was and who you could still become. Love always, Mom." The words dissolved something inside him. He looked up at Natalie, whose eyes now brimmed with tears. But she wasn't crying out of pain. It was something deeper, recognition, a wound finally named. For the first time, Jonathan felt like his mother was still in the room. Liam stirred softly in the crib, but didn't wake. The rain outside eased into a drizzle. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called into the night. Natalie closed the album and exhaled slowly. "I didn't come here expecting this." Jonathan shook his head. "Neither did I." Their eyes met, and for a moment, the silence said more than any words could. But then a new sound broke through the stillness. A sharp knock at the front door. 3 precise taps. Jonathan's head turned. Natalie stiffened. It was nearly 3 in the morning. No one should have been outside. And just like that, the warmth of discovery gave way to something colder. A chill beneath the floorboards. A warning neither of them could explain yet. Because while one door to the past had just opened, another, far more dangerous one, was waiting to be unlocked. The morning after the letter, nothing looked the same. The rain had cleared, but the air over the Winters estate remained thick, electric, as if the storm had only paused. Inside the mansion, the staff moved more slowly. Doors opened and closed with caution. It was as if the entire house could feel the shift that had taken place, even if no one dared speak it aloud. Jonathan hadn't slept. He sat at the edge of Liam's crib, elbows on his knees, watching his son breathe. The baby slept peacefully, his small hand curled around the edge of his blanket, just like Jonathan used to do when his mother tucked him in as a boy. He heard footsteps behind him. When he turned, he saw Rachel, elegant as always, but different this morning. Her heels were missing. Her silk robe was slightly wrinkled. Her eyes, once sharp and icy, now looked hollow. "He didn't cry all night," she said. Jonathan nodded. She walked toward the window, letting the morning sun cast patterns over her pale arms. "What did you do?" she asked. It didn't sound like an accusation. It sounded like defeat. He stood slowly. "I didn't do anything, Natalie did." Rachel turned to him, blinking. "The laundry girl? She's not just that." His voice was calm, firm. Rachel gave a hollow laugh, more like a breath than anything else. "I haven't been able to hold him for more than 5 minutes without him screaming. He doesn't want me, John." Jonathan took a step toward her. "He's not rejecting you. He's overwhelmed. And Natalie is what?" she snapped, suddenly sharp again. "Some miracle worker who shows up out of nowhere and fixes everything?" Jonathan didn't answer. "She's a stranger," Rachel continued, crossing her arms. "We don't know her. We don't know where she came from. And now you're trusting her with our child." He looked at her for a long moment. "She knew the lullaby," he said quietly, "the one my mother made up." Rachel stiffened. "She knew it note for note. She has a photograph of my mom holding her. She lived in the same home my mother volunteered at. My mom left me a letter, Rachel. She wanted to adopt Natalie. She called her the bridge between who I was and who you could become. Rachel's lips parted slightly, then closed again. Downstairs, something crashed. Porcelain on marble. A maid dropped a tray. No one moved to clean it right away. None of this makes sense, Rachel whispered. Jonathan's voice softened. It's not supposed to. It's not a business plan. It's not one of your curated fundraisers. This is something else. Rachel's face trembled for a second, just long enough for something real to slip through. I'm tired, she said. I haven't slept in days. I'm trying to be everything I'm supposed to be, and I'm failing. Jonathan's heart tightened. I know, he said gently, but maybe right now, being everything isn't what Liam needs. Maybe he just needs presence and stillness. And Natalie? Rachel asked, almost bitterly. She listens, he said simply, and when she holds him, he remembers something the rest of us forgot. Later that day, the head nanny submitted her resignation. I'm sorry, she told Jonathan and Rachel, but I believe this child needs something different, and I'm no longer the right person to give it. Rachel said nothing. Jonathan only nodded. With the nursery left unstaffed and Liam refusing to stay with anyone else, the decision fell into his hands, and he made it, quietly, but unmistakably. Natalie would take over Liam's care, not as a cleaner, not as an emergency measure, but officially, temporarily, with full access and authority over his routine, well-being and emotional environment. He drafted the paperwork that same afternoon. He called a family lawyer, one of the few he still trusted, and signed a temporary guardianship request, placing Natalie's name next to Liam's. When Rachel found out, she didn't scream. She stared at him with wide, trembling eyes. You gave her legal authority over our child, she whispered. Only for now, he said, until Liam stabilizes, until we figure out what this connection is. She's not even blood. No, he said, she's heart. Before Rachel could answer, another voice exploded through the room. You will revoke that signature, immediately. They both turned. At the top of the stairs, in full political posture, stood Senator Grant Bennett, Rachel's father. His presence filled the room like a gavel hitting a podium. How long have you known? Grant demanded, stepping down the staircase, each footfall echoing with menace. How long have you been planning to dismantle this family from the inside? Jonathan straightened. I didn't plan anything, Grant. I protected my son. You think this girl didn't manipulate her way in here? You think she didn't know exactly what she was doing? Grant's voice thundered. This smells like blackmail, like infiltration, and I will not let you destroy our legacy with your bleeding heart. Rachel said nothing, but Jonathan took a step forward. If protecting my child from distress is what you call destruction, then maybe your legacy isn't worth saving. Grant's face darkened. Do you have any idea what kind of enemies you're making by elevating that girl? She's not a girl, she's a survivor, Jonathan said calmly. And if you knew half of what she's been through, you'd realize she's stronger than any of us. Grant turned to Rachel. You'll let him do this? Rachel didn't look at him, and that silence was answer enough. Grant's voice dropped to a deadly low. You're making a mistake, son. And when this house burns, don't expect me to put out the fire. Then he walked out, but the damage didn't wait for fire. That night, someone tampered with the nursery cameras. Natalie noticed first. The screen on the hallway monitor flashed, glitched, then went black. When she walked in, Liam was crying again. Not in pain, but panic, the kind of cry that rises from fear. She picked him up and scanned the room. Nothing seemed missing, but something felt disturbed. Later, Jonathan would find a thin silver USB drive tucked under the mattress, containing corrupted files and photos of Natalie taken weeks before she was ever hired. The message was clear. Someone was watching her, and someone didn't want her there. But what they didn't know, what Grant didn't know, was that Natalie had stopped following the script she was given a long time ago. And her reason for staying was no longer about orders. It was about Liam, and she wasn't going anywhere. The sky over the Winters estate woke heavy and grey, like even the weather had caught wind of the truth pushing its way to the surface. It wasn't just the air, thick with static. It was the hush that settled over the house, the kind of silence that came before something broke. Ever since the incident with the nursery cameras, Jonathan had been revisiting every detail of Natalie's hiring. The request had supposedly come from Rachel's assistant. The agency responded with Natalie's name, contract, and credentials. Everything had seemed routine until that USB drive appeared, until someone slipped images of Natalie into his son's crib, images taken weeks before she ever set foot inside the house. That morning, Jonathan sat at the desk in his private library, staring at the employment verification system used for all staff across the estate. It was a secure internal platform, only he had direct access to it. He typed her full name slowly, Natalie Amelia Carter. Nothing. He blinked, refreshed the page. No valid employee file found. He frowned, double-checked spelling, searched by ID number from the original contract file. Invalid registration, no active contract. Referring agency inactive. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, heart thudding. The agency that had allegedly placed Natalie, Harper and Moore Domestic Services had ceased operations 4 months ago. Their license had been revoked. No trace of any recent employment, no functioning phone number. Who then had placed her here? And why? That afternoon, he asked to speak with her, not in the hallway, not in the nursery, but in the old music studio his mother once used. The room had been untouched for years, still holding the faint scent of old piano wood and lavender. Natalie entered silently, but this time she didn't carry the quiet posture of a housemaid. She stepped in like someone who expected to be confronted. Jonathan didn't waste time. The agency that placed you doesn't exist anymore, he said. She didn't flinch. There's no record of your employment, no digital signature on the contract. No authorization in the system. You were never supposed to be here. She looked at him without fear. I know. Jonathan stared at her. Then who sent you? She hesitated, and then quietly, I was placed here by a group. I don't know their formal name, but among themselves they call it the Blue Order. The name hit him like a punch. He'd heard whispers before, cryptic references in backroom conversations, redacted files his father had once locked in a hidden cabinet. The Blue Order had always been a rumor, a phantom. Now, it had a face. What do they want with my son? Natalie's voice dropped. Control, leverage, the emotional destabilization of a public legacy. Liam isn't just a baby to them, he's a symbol. If they can prove neglect, mental unfitness, or emotional volatility within your household, they can manipulate public opinion, push for custody battles, or worse, influence the legal future of the Winters name. Jonathan walked slowly across the room, pulse rising. You were part of this? I was sent, she admitted. My instructions were to observe, get close to Liam, record his behavior, gather documentation. Why didn't you? He demanded. She looked up, eyes raw but steady. Because the first time I heard him cry, something broke inside me, not as an agent, not as an orphan, but as a human being. Jonathan's breath caught. I held him, she whispered, and I remembered. Not orders, not manipulation. I remembered what it felt like to be ignored, to scream and not be heard. Jonathan moved closer, his voice low. And they turned on you? They went quiet at first, she said. Then the messages changed. They told me to step back, to let the child fail to attach. But I didn't. And now, they're watching me too. Why stay, he asked. Why risk everything? Because Liam needs someone who listens. And because, she hesitated, voice trembling, you needed someone who remembered what your mother stood for. The room fell into stillness. Then, slowly, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small envelope. "I found this hidden in your mother's room," she said. "Behind the coffer in the nursery. I wasn't looking for it. I was trying to protect Liam. But it was meant for you." Jonathan opened the envelope. Inside was a key wrapped in linen cloth. An address was written in neat script. Room 04, North Wing Sublevel, Inactive Archive Vault. His chest tightened. The North Wing archive had been sealed for over 15 years, since before his mother's stroke. It had once been used to store family records, legal documents, and emergency supplies. No one had stepped foot inside since. "She left the key," Natalie said. Whatever she didn't say out loud, she left it there. That night, after Rachel fell asleep and Liam was safely in his crib, Jonathan and Natalie descended the old marble steps that led to the archive vault. It smelled of dust, stone, and secrets. The walls were lined with rusting lamps and outdated alarm panels. The key turned slowly in the lock, metal grinding against age. When the door creaked open, they stepped into a room buried in time. There were boxes, folders, locked cabinets, old drives, and in the center, resting on a table like it had been waiting for years, was a blue file marked in faded ink. The Blue Order, Domestic Protocols. Jonathan opened it with shaking hands. Inside were names, hundreds of them, congressmen, judges, military officers, business executives, each connected through financial trails, behavioral assessments, surveillance programs. His mother had compiled all of it. She had known. "She tried to stop them," he whispered. Natalie nodded. "And they silenced her before she could finish." Tucked inside the folder was another letter. This one was addressed directly to Jonathan. He read it aloud. "If you find this, then you have chosen to listen. Natalie is not an accident. She is the echo of a promise I never got to keep. She is the bridge between everything I feared and everything I prayed you'd become. Please don't let them silence her, or you. You are not your father. You are my son. Mom." The silence that followed was not empty. It was sacred. Natalie stepped back, wiping her eyes, though the tears barely touched her cheeks. Then a noise, a click, then footsteps. They weren't alone. Jonathan turned toward the corridor, and from the shadows emerged a voice, cold, familiar. "I warned you she was a threat." It was Senator Grant Bennett. Natalie's breath caught. Behind him, two men, suited, armed, unmarked. Jonathan stepped instinctively in front of Natalie. Because now, the truth wasn't just dangerous. It was deadly. The click of the gun echoed like thunder in the corridor. Jonathan froze. Natalie didn't need to ask whose voice that was. She knew it the moment it pierced the silence. Senator Grant Bennett. He stepped forward out of the shadows, composed, calm, as if he'd been watching them longer than either of them knew. His coat was soaked from the rain, but his eyes held the kind of cold that didn't come from weather. His right hand was buried in his pocket, fingers wrapped around something metallic, subtle, but unmistakably threatening. "You were never supposed to come down here, Jonathan," he said, voice quiet but razor sharp. "And she was never supposed to leave the kitchen." Natalie instinctively stepped in front of Jonathan, shielding him without thinking. Her body was taut, alert. She didn't flinch. She was past fear. Grant smiled faintly. "You think you're the first Winters to try to purify this house?" he continued, tone low and poisonous. "You think you're different from your father? Different from your mother?" Jonathan's fists tightened at his sides. "I thought this family still had a soul," he replied, "but now I see how deep the rot goes." Grant shook his head as if disappointed. "You were supposed to lead. You were raised to protect the legacy. But then she shows up, this orphan with no past, and suddenly your loyalty turns to delusion." "She didn't manipulate anyone," Jonathan said, voice rising. "She saved my son. By exposing you to the world, Grant barked. By opening files that should have burned with your mother. Jonathan stared at him, jaw tight. Those files are the truth, and I'd rather burn the legacy than let it keep burying people. Grant's eyes darkened. This house stood for something, for order, for power. And now it will be remembered for one thing, your weakness. Behind him, two figures emerged, dressed in black, earpieces in, eyes expressionless. Mercenaries. Jonathan felt Natalie tense beside him. "Bunker," she whispered. He didn't hesitate. They turned and ran. Through the narrow passage, past the archive shelves, until they reached the hidden panel his mother had shown him when he was a teenager. He pulled the carved wooden shelf aside, exposing a steel button embedded in the wall. He slammed his palm against it. With a low hiss, the stone panel beside them slid open, revealing a dark, narrow stairwell. Natalie slipped inside first, clutching the blue folder tight to her chest. Jonathan followed, locking the entrance from within. The mechanism sealed with a heavy metallic thud. They were safe, for now. The bunker was a forgotten wing, buried deep beneath the North Wing, built decades ago as a Cold War shelter. His grandfather had spared no expense, and his mother had preserved it, though no one had used it in years. The lights flickered on, faint, warm, like a heartbeat. Inside, the air was still, the silence absolute. Concrete walls surrounded them. A rusted desk stood against the far end. Metal shelves, half-stocked with old supplies and flashlights. A terminal powered by a backup generator hummed in the corner. Natalie placed the folder on the desk and opened it. Inside were the names. Dozens of them, hundreds, politicians, military leaders, corporate CEOs, all connected by contracts, bank transfers, meeting transcripts, and encrypted communications, each one linked to the secret organization she had named before, the Blue Order. Jonathan stood behind her, silent, his eyes wide. He reached out slowly and lifted one page after another, reading the signatures, the dates, the code words scribbled in the margins. His hands shook. "These are real," he whispered. Natalie nodded. "Your mother documented everything. She tried to protect you. She just didn't have time to finish." Among the files was a sealed envelope, delicate with age. On the front, in soft ink, "For Jonathan, when courage finally meets the truth." He opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a letter. "If you're reading this, you've chosen to listen. Natalie wasn't a mistake. She was my unfinished promise. I tried to adopt her when the world told me not to. I tried to save her mother. I tried to break the chain, but the order is bigger than this house. Don't let them silence her. Don't let them twist the truth. You are not your father. You are who I prayed you'd become. With love, Mom." He closed his eyes. His throat tightened. Natalie turned to him, her face unreadable. "She left this for you." He nodded slowly. She always knew they were watching. Natalie crossed to the terminal. She began typing swiftly, pulling up the secure backup drive. "I'm sending everything," she said, "to a journalist I trust, a university archive, and an independent film group. They'll mirror it before the order can scrub it." Jonathan watched her work. The tension in the air wasn't fear anymore. It was resolve. The console pinged. Transfer in progress. Above them, the bunker walls began to vibrate, thumps and thuds coming from far off. They were trying to break through the archive doors. There wasn't much time. Jonathan walked to a small monitor that displayed security camera feeds. He toggled through until he found Liam's nursery. Still sleeping. Safe. For now. But how much longer? "We have to be ready to run," he said. Natalie nodded. "There's a second exit, behind the storage crates. It opens to the western greenhouse." "You've been here before," he said quietly. She met his gaze. "Your mother brought me once, when I was little. Said it was the safest place in the house." The console beeped again. "Transfer complete," The evidence was out. The truth was now a living thing. Jonathan turned toward her as the room around them seemed to tighten. "We can't go back after this." "No," she said, "but maybe that's the point." A sudden bang exploded from above, louder than before. They were close. Jonathan grabbed the folder, placed it in a metal case, and looked toward the exit panel. But just before he reached it, the backup radio crackled to life. A familiar voice cut through the static. "Jonathan, Natalie, step out now, and I'll let the child live. Grant." Jonathan's blood froze. Natalie's eyes snapped to the screen. Liam's camera was no longer showing his crib, just static. And in that moment, they both knew the war had begun. Inside the hidden greenhouse tunnel beneath the Winters estate, the only sound was their breathing. Shallow, controlled, like the air itself might collapse if disturbed too harshly. Jonathan clutched the case with the blue order files. Natalie led the way, flashlight trembling in her grip. Every step down the narrow passage was deliberate, rehearsed, though neither of them had ever prepared for this moment. Behind them, the bunker echoed with distant pounding. Above them, Liam's nursery camera was still static. They didn't speak. There was no room for words now. At the end of the tunnel, a hatch opened into the western greenhouse, long abandoned and overgrown. The scent of soil, wet glass, and forgotten flowers filled their lungs. Natalie reached up, pulled back the ivy-covered hatch, and they climbed into the faint blue light of pre-dawn. Jonathan turned toward the house, now just a silhouette against the sky. "I have to go to him," he said, voice barely more than a breath. "I know," Natalie replied. He hesitated. "What if I'm too late?" She looked at him, really looked at him. Not as a man running from his family's legacy, but as a father trembling at the edge of collapse. "Then let me come with you." They moved as one, through the shadows of the estate, weaving past hedges and marble fountains, until they reached a service door near the east wing. Jonathan used his thumbprint to unlock the emergency access. The hallway was empty, silent. No guards, no lights, only tension. Step by step they approached the nursery, and then Jonathan heard it, a soft sound humming, not just any melody, the lullaby, faint, distant, echoing through the house like a ghost brushing against its own memory. Jonathan stopped, his breath caught. "That's her," he whispered. Natalie froze. They turned the corner. The nursery door was ajar. Inside, Liam was lying in his crib, eyes closed, peaceful. And next to him, sitting in the rocking chair, humming the lullaby in a trembling, broken rhythm, was Rachel. Her hair was disheveled, her robe stained with tears. Her hand trembled as she brushed it across the air above Liam's chest, never touching, just hovering, as if afraid to shatter what she had never been able to hold. Jonathan stepped into the room. "Rachel?" She didn't turn. "I heard it," she whispered, "the melody, over and over, in my sleep, in my bones. It's hers, isn't it, your mother's?" Natalie entered slowly. She didn't speak. "I never could connect to him," Rachel said, eyes locked on Liam. "Not like you, not like her. I tried to love him the way I was taught, through control, through discipline, through distance." Jonathan came closer. "You don't have to explain." "Yes, I do," her voice cracked. "Because while I was busy trying to keep order, you were busy trying to remember love. And she," Rachel turned to Natalie, "she carried it in a song." The three of them stood there for a moment. No war, no judgment. Just pain, raw and suspended. Rachel reached into her pocket and pulled out something folded. A crumpled page. "I found this in the safe you never opened," she said, handing it to Jonathan. "It was addressed to both of us." He opened it slowly. "If you ever forget how to love a child, hum this. If you ever feel like a stranger in your own home, sing this. This lullaby isn't just a song, it's a memory, a map, a key. It saved me once. It might save you too. No signature, but they all knew whose handwriting it was. Rachel finally stood. "Grant was here," she said. "He threatened me, said you were going to ruin everything, that you had betrayed your bloodline." Jonathan's hands tightened. "I told him to leave," she continued, "but I don't think he did." Natalie stepped forward. "We need to move. Now. The evidence is out, but they'll try to contain it, maybe even erase us." Jonathan nodded. "We take Liam and disappear for now. I know a place, but we leave tonight." "What about the rest of the staff?" Rachel asked. "They'll be fine," Jonathan said. "They're not the targets. We are." Just then Liam stirred. His eyes fluttered open, and for the first time in days, he didn't cry. He looked at Natalie, and then reached for her. She picked him up gently, his tiny hand curled against her chest. He let out a small sound, half sigh, half giggle, a sound none of them had heard before, a sound that didn't come from survival. It came from peace. Rachel stepped back. "I think," she said softly, "I was never meant to be his only mother." Natalie turned to her, eyes full. "You don't have to leave. We just have to change what mother means." Jonathan stood between them, the case still in hand, the child between histories. And in that moment, none of them knew where they would end up. But the melody, that melody, now lived in all of them. As they left the nursery, Natalie paused at the threshold. She looked back one last time. "I used to hum that song to myself," she whispered, mostly to the walls. "Back when I was a child with no home, no name. I didn't know where it came from." Jonathan touched her shoulder. "It came from her." Natalie nodded. "And now, it saved him." A beat of silence. Then the sound of a door creaking, a shadow at the end of the hall. Someone was coming. But this time, they were ready. 2 weeks after the escape, the Winters estate stood frozen in time. The gardens remained untouched. The grand chandeliers still hung above the silent halls. But the heart of the house, its rhythm, its secrets, had already been exhaled into the world. Across the country, screens flickered to life, and the title appeared, "Silent Cry," the story they tried to bury. No logos, no narrator. Just a baby's cry, raw and uninterrupted, layered over scenes of cold marble floors, long hallways and closed doors. Then came the voice, Natalie's voice. "They told me not to hold him. They said my job was to clean, but he was screaming." And I remembered that sound, because once I was the child no one answered. The first 5 minutes of the film spread like wildfire. By the time it reached hour 2, it was already being translated into Spanish, Portuguese, Hindi, and Arabic. Professors paused lectures to stream it. University auditoriums turned down lights. NGO boards replayed key chapters over and over. Psychologists, journalists, and survivors took to social media, unified by a single reaction: "This can't be ignored." Rachel had produced the documentary. She appeared only once in the film, face bare, voice calm, eyes tired. I thought I was doing everything right. Schedules, silence, control. But then I saw what love looked like when no one was watching. It didn't come in the form of a mother. It came in the form of a stranger who listened. She said no more. She didn't need to. The footage did the rest. Hidden camera angles from the nursery, audio clips of Senator Grant Bennett speaking in veiled threats, snippets from the vault, bank records, annotated emails, and hard drive footage from the secret bunker. And over all of it, the sound of the lullaby, faint, haunting, steady, playing beneath every revelation. The film didn't just expose corruption, it reframed care. Natalie's interview was the centerpiece. No dramatization, no victim framing. Just her, speaking slowly, vulnerably, with eyes that carried decades of abandonment and survival. I didn't know I was born to listen. I didn't know silence could be taught like a language. But he, Liam, he spoke it. He reminded me. The phrase that broke the internet wasn't scripted, it wasn't polished. It came from a quiet moment at the end of her segment. Love didn't come with a surname, it came with a sound. The world held its breath. The backlash was instant and divided. Political officials rushed to deny any connection with the Blue Order. Old guard media tried to shift the narrative. Disgruntled maid, manipulated child, fabricated audio. But truth doesn't beg to be believed. It just stands still and waits. And this truth had been documented in real time. Crowdfunding sites launched within 24 hours. A class action petition to open a federal investigation reached 500,000 signatures in under 3 days. University law students volunteered pro bono. Trauma therapists opened free sessions for survivors of emotional abandonment. Natalie received over 12,000 letters, not fan mail, witness testimonies from women, from foster children, from nurses, from sons of powerful men, from teachers who had seen too much and said too little. And in the middle of all this noise, Natalie stayed quiet. She didn't give interviews. She didn't post on social media. She stayed in a cabin in northern Vermont with Jonathan and Liam, hidden but not hiding. Because what they were building now was not just a family, it was a foundation. Jonathan had already begun liquidating assets, shifting shares, cutting ties with dormant board members and shadowy partners. The Blue Order had fractured, but it hadn't fallen, not yet. That would take institutions, and institutions were slow. But stories moved faster. The film reached Congress within 10 days. An independent investigative panel requested copies of all original footage and documentation. Rachel met with them personally, calm, poised, determined. "I failed my son once," she said in the hearing. "I won't fail him again." It wasn't for show. She no longer wanted to be seen. She wanted to make space for someone else to be heard. The committee asked Natalie to testify. She said no, but she sent something instead, a recording. No video, just audio. Her voice was soft, nearly trembling. "I was told that blood defines family, but no drop of blood ever taught me how to sing that lullaby. A woman who wasn't my mother once hummed it to me in a shelter. Years later, I hummed it to a child I didn't birth, and he stopped crying. Maybe that's what love is. A memory we pass forward, one heartbeat at a time." A long silence followed the playback. One of the senators wiped tears discreetly. Another, long known for voting against family aid programs, excused herself from the room. The proposal for a national task force on emotional neglect was born the same day. Jonathan, meanwhile, was preparing something larger, not for court, for the people. He announced the launch of the Foundation for Listening, its mission to redefine care, to protect the unheard, to train caregivers, teachers, and health workers to recognize emotional trauma not through symptoms, but through silence. At its core were 3 voices: Jonathan's financial reach, Rachel's platform, and Natalie's story. Liam would grow up with all 3, but with none of their shadows, because for the first time in decades, there was nothing left to hide, or so they thought. One morning, 2 weeks after the Foundation's launch, a man walked into their cabin holding a weathered satchel. Tall, quiet, familiar eyes. Natalie opened the door and dropped the coffee in her hand. "Richard," she whispered. He nodded. Her brother. Gone since she was 8, assumed dead, or lost, or absorbed into the foster system and never heard from again. But here he was, alive. And what he carried in that satchel would change everything again. The courtroom wasn't grand. It wasn't filled with marble columns or gold emblems. It was quiet, wood-paneled, intimate. And yet, for Natalie, it felt like the most sacred space she had ever stepped into. Not because of its appearance, but because for the first time in her life, someone had summoned her not to punish her, but to listen. She sat in the front row, next to Liam, who clutched his toy giraffe with one hand and the hem of her coat with the other. He didn't cry. He hadn't for days. His eyes were wide, curious, steady, watching the world as if it finally made sense. Jonathan sat beside them, posture protective, but not defensive. Rachel was 2 seats away, her face composed, her presence a quiet show of solidarity. They weren't fighting custody. They were fighting for truth to be recognized as something deeper than paperwork. The hearing was scheduled under a special provision, petition for legal recognition of emotional bond. Rare, almost never granted. But after the documentary aired, the court had no choice but to respond. People gathered outside. Not protesters, not reporters, just ordinary people, teachers, single mothers, therapists, social workers, holding signs that read, "Listening is care. Love isn't just biological. Protect emotional truth." Inside, the judge, an older woman with short silver hair and a gaze that could disarm or destroy, entered the chamber. She sat without speaking, studied the room, then nodded for the hearing to begin. Natalie stood. She didn't have a lawyer. She didn't read from a statement. She just breathed in and spoke. "I never asked to be called a mother. I never tried to take someone's place. I only did what I wished someone had done for me." She paused. I listened to him, not just to his cries, but to his silence. There was no performance in her voice, no script, just raw truth. Then the court reviewed the footage. They watched how Liam calmed only in Natalie's arms, how he mirrored her breathing, how his heartbeat slowed when she hummed the lullaby. The psychologist's report followed, detailing the nonverbal attachment patterns, the safety cues, the neurobiological evidence that this wasn't just comfort. It was bond. The final piece came from Rachel. She stood and approached the center, her voice calm but trembling with something deeper than nerves. "I didn't lose my child to another woman," she said. "I found him through her." The courtroom fell into stillness. Then the judge leaned forward. She looked at Liam, then Natalie, then the empty space between them, and she said, "This is not adoption, this is reparation." A single sentence, but it reverberated across the country. The ruling was made public minutes later. Natalie Carter was granted full legal rights as co-parent and emotional guardian of Liam Winters, not as a surrogate, not as a nanny, but as someone who had become family through presence, pain, and love. The media exploded, but it wasn't the kind of media frenzy that chased scandals. It was reverent, historic. The phrase, "This is not adoption, this is reparation," was printed across magazine covers, shared on digital banners, etched into university lectures. A movement was born. Social workers began re-examining emotional bond cases. Courts revisited failed kinship placements. A national hotline for emotionally displaced children was launched and overloaded within the first 24 hours. The law had finally listened, and Natalie, she still didn't speak much. But when she walked out of the courthouse holding Liam in her arms, Jonathan at her side, and Rachel quietly behind, the crowd didn't cheer. They breathed, as if they had all been waiting to exhale. Later that night in the Vermont cabin, Liam fell asleep to the sound of Natalie humming. Jonathan sat on the porch, watching fireflies blink across the dark field. And then, headlights, slow, steady, familiar. A car parked, and from the driver's seat emerged Richard Carter, Natalie's brother. She opened the door before he could knock. He looked older, worn, but his eyes, those same eyes, hadn't changed. They stood in silence for several seconds before Natalie whispered, "You're alive." He nodded. "I was always alive. I just wasn't safe." He stepped inside and placed a worn leather satchel on the table. Inside, journals, flash drives, old cassette tapes, fingerprints, letters, names. He had been inside the Blue Order, not as a traitor, as a child recruit. And he had escaped. "What I have," he said quietly, "could bring down half the country." Jonathan glanced at the files, then at Natalie, whose hand trembled as she reached for her brother's. "Then we start again," she said. "Not for revenge," Richard added. Natalie nodded. "For restoration." Outside, the wind shifted. Inside, Liam stirred in his sleep and turned his face toward the sound of Natalie's voice. She whispered the lullaby again. And for the first time since the ruling, she let herself cry. The satchel Richard Carter placed on the table looked ordinary, but what it contained, what it meant, was anything but. Jonathan opened it slowly, Natalie at his side. Liam was asleep upstairs, unaware that below him, the walls of power were beginning to crack. Inside were journals, worn and water-stained, thumb drives with no labels, cassettes with dates instead of titles. Each item had a story etched into its surface, trauma preserved through ink and time. Richard stood by the window, eyes heavy with memory. "They called it resilience training," he said, "but it was indoctrination, emotional suppression, mental coding." Natalie reached for one of the journals. The cover had a faint handprint, small, childlike. "Where were you?" she asked softly. "They moved me through 13 placements. No real names. I wasn't allowed to ask questions. Every time I got too close to someone, they'd call it a failure and transfer me. Until eventually I stopped trying." Jonathan looked through the notes, pages written in block letters by a child forced to report like a soldier. "Do not cry. Eye contact, Dali's weakness. No attachment. Orders, safety." Dozens of entries, each more dehumanizing than the last. "They trained kids like machines," Richard said, "to infiltrate families, to gather leverage. Sometimes we were placed in wealthy homes, other times in strategic middle-class neighborhoods. The goal was always the same, emotional surveillance." Jonathan swallowed hard. "This was orchestrated?" "Systemically," Richard replied, "backed by silent donors, politicians, institutions that needed families weak to keep systems strong." Natalie opened one of the flash drives on Jonathan's encrypted laptop. Inside, spreadsheets, documents, audio files. She clicked on the first folder. Primary assets, Tier 1 families. Dozens of names, household profiles, private notes, psychological assessments, even genetic markers. "Wait," Jonathan said, scanning the list. "These are real families." "Some still active," Richard added. "Others quietly erased." Rachel entered the room, barefoot, holding 2 mugs of tea. She listened as they recounted what they had found, her face growing paler by the minute. "Why families?" she asked. Richard turned to her. "Because families are the last place people believe they're being watched." One file stood out. "Winter's Estate, protocol designation Haven." Jonathan clicked. Inside was a full operational map of his home, surveillance schedules, staff bios, emotional stress testing records, even his mother's medical reports. Natalie's hiring had been planned years before she ever set foot on the estate. Natalie covered her mouth. "They planned for me." "They planned for everyone," Richard said, "but they didn't plan for love." He clicked open a cassette transfer. The static cleared. Then a voice, tired, feminine, urgent. "If you're hearing this, you've already been marked. They watch, they listen, but they don't feel. That's their weakness. If we can teach the country to listen again, truly listen, we can dismantle them from within." It was Jonathan's mother, her final recording. Natalie's eyes filled with tears. "She knew," she whispered. And then Jonathan stood. "We need to go public. Again. This time. With everything. But carefully," Rachel added. "This isn't a documentary anymore, it's a dismantling." Over the next week, they built what they called the Pulse Room, a digital war room based inside a Vermont barn with reinforced firewalls, cloud redundancy, and legal liaisons standing by. A small team joined them: activists, professors, child psychologists, investigative journalists, whistleblowers. They reviewed every file, verified every voice, redacted only when absolutely necessary, and then they launched. The first report dropped under a simple title: The Listening Files, Part 1, The Children They Reprogrammed. It was shared 2.3 million times in the first 48 hours. A senator resigned within 3 days. A judge recused herself from 47 past rulings. 2 CEOs fled the country, and yet not a word from Grant Bennett. Until the 7th day. Natalie opened the cabin mailbox and found a black envelope. No return address. Inside, a single sentence handwritten in silver ink: "The higher you go, the quieter it gets." Jonathan called it what it was: a threat. Richard shook his head. "No, it's a warning." That night, Natalie recorded her second public statement. It wasn't viral. It was sacred. She stood in front of the barn wall, wearing no makeup, no branding, just her voice. "They tried to erase people like me, but we are not here to scream. We are here to listen, until silence becomes impossible to ignore." She paused. "If your story was stolen, you are not broken. You are proof." That clip became part of a national education campaign. It wasn't flashy, it was true, and that was louder than anything the Blue Order could whisper. Meanwhile, subpoenas were issued. The Senate scheduled an emergency hearing on institutional infiltration and emotional manipulation. Jonathan was called to testify. So was Rachel. And, most unexpectedly, so was Natalie. She didn't want to go. But Jonathan looked her in the eye and said, "You are no longer the ghost in their records. You are the truth in ours." She nodded. 1 week later, she would walk into the most powerful room in the country, not as a maid, not as a pawn, but as the woman who listened to a baby when no one else did, and uncovered the empire built on that silence. The air inside the congressional hearing room was unnaturally still. No side chatter, no rustling of papers, no clicks of pens, just silence. Not the kind born from protocol, the kind born from gravity. Natalie stood at the front, behind the microphone, a single sheet of paper in her hand. Though she hadn't looked at it once. Cameras were everywhere. Faces watched her from the chamber, from screens, from across the nation. Some were curious, others doubtful, but many were quiet because, deep down, they knew. They had heard of her. They just never heard her. She adjusted the mic, took a breath, and began. "My name is Natalie Amelia Carter. I am not a politician. I am not a lawyer. I am not a mother by birth. I am someone who listened." The sentence echoed into the silence. "I was born without a last name. I grew up in places where names were traded for numbers and silence was survival. I cleaned houses. I folded other people's memories. I was hired to disappear." She paused, her voice unwavering. "But one day, in a house that never asked for my name, I heard a baby crying. Not for food, not for toys, for someone to listen." Jonathan and Rachel sat in the second row. Liam was with Richard, watching from a quiet room nearby. I held him, and I hummed a lullaby I didn't know I remembered. He stopped crying, and in that moment, I realized something. That love doesn't need permission. It only needs presence. She looked up, eyes sweeping across rows of lawmakers, advisors, and press. "I'm not here today to seek justice for myself. I'm here to ask you to listen. To the children who speak without words, to the caregivers who love without titles, to the people who exist in the margins because they were never taught they mattered." She stepped back, voice softening. "Silence isn't neutrality, it's complicity." And then, the words that would be etched into history. Listening is care. Silence is complicity. When she sat down, the room remained frozen. Not because they were shocked, but because something had shifted. A silence had broken, and it would not return quietly. The next morning, those words were printed across banners, billboards, classroom walls, and courthouse steps. Teachers quoted her in morning announcements. Activists stitched her words into protest signs. A poem, handwritten by a 10-year-old foster child, was published on the front page of a major newspaper with the title, "She Heard Me." And in Congress, the Listen Act was formally introduced. Its core goals: establish emotional listening training for foster systems, social workers, and educators. Create legal pathways for the recognition of emotional bonds in custody hearings. Fund national research on the long-term effects of emotional neglect. And above all, validate care beyond bloodlines. Natalie was not present the day the bill was proposed. She had gone home to Vermont. But that didn't stop people from carrying her name into the chambers. The Natalie Carter Clause became the emotional cornerstone of the legislation. It protected caregivers like her, listeners, the unacknowledged. And while lobbyists fought behind the scenes to delay it, the public wouldn't allow silence again. Jonathan, now formally separated from the Winters legacy, donated the remaining family shares to fund the Foundation for Listening. Rachel became the Foundation's public liaison, an act of humility the world did not expect but quietly honored. And Natalie? She stayed with Liam. They gardened, cooked, sat in silence, and sometimes she would catch him humming the lullaby back to her, off-key, clumsy, and perfect. One night, while tucking him in, Liam looked up at her and whispered, "I remember your sound." Natalie blinked. "My what?" "Your sound," he said. "The one that made the noise go away." She pressed a kiss to his forehead. That sound wasn't a melody. It was safety. That same week, a judge in another state cited her congressional statement in a custody ruling. Then another, then a third. Natalie's words weren't just heard, they were changing law. And yet, she refused to be turned into a brand. She declined speaking tours, refused to sign books, turned down every request for monetization. When asked why, she answered simply, "Listening should never be for sale." In the background, the Foundation for Listening grew. The team worked on outreach, training, healing. Survivors began coming forward with stories, some decades old, some still unfolding. But in the shadows, the Blue Order still stirred. It hadn't fallen, not completely. Richard continued to uncover files, buried in state archives, sealed in youth rehabilitation centers. He knew the real confrontation was coming, and Natalie, she had already prepared her final words for it, not for another hearing, not for a documentary, for Liam. She wrote them on a piece of cloth, stitched into the inside of a jacket she made for him. It read, "When the world is too loud to hear you, remember, you were once held in silence, and it saved your life." Because in the end, what saved them wasn't revolution. It was a song, and someone willing to stop and listen. The snow began to fall just as the letter arrived. It came by hand, no stamps, no digital copy. Just a cream-colored envelope with a golden seal embossed in the corner. United States Department of Family Justice. Jonathan opened it first, standing in the doorway of their Vermont cabin, snow gathering on his shoulders. He didn't speak. He simply turned, walked back inside, and handed it to Natalie. She sat at the kitchen table, Liam coloring beside her. The fire crackled in the background. The scent of cinnamon and pine lingered in the air. Her hands trembled as she broke the seal. Inside was a single page, no ceremony, just language clean and direct. This letter affirms the official recognition by federal decree of Natalie Amelia Carter as legal and historical caregiver, protector, and emotionally bonded maternal figure to Liam Alexander Winters. This status is permanent, irrevocable, and reflective not of biology, but of bond. Status title granted, Mother of Record. She covered her mouth with both hands. Liam looked up at her, confused at first. then smiled as if somehow he already knew. Outside, the wind howled softly, but inside, something finally settled. A week later, they returned to Washington. This time, not for court, for closure. The Senate floor had been cleared for a single, symbolic moment, not political, not performative, just necessary. At the center stood a podium. Behind it, a document etched in glass. The Listen Act, ratified. The Natalie Carter Clause, adopted. Dozens of families attended, survivors, teachers, judges who had overturned their own rulings in light of the evidence. Rachel sat beside them, calm and proud. Richard remained in the background, carrying a satchel that now held the ashes of the Order's final secrets, files decrypted and archived, their power neutralized by truth. Jonathan stood with his arm around Natalie. When her name was called, she didn't cry. She walked. To the front, to the podium, to the microphone, and said only this: there is no such thing as a small voice. There is only a world too loud to hear it. Thank you for finally listening. The applause wasn't thunderous. It was soft, like reverence. That same night, in a closed ceremony, the Foundation for Listening was inaugurated, not in a boardroom, not at a gala, but in a quiet community center where a group of women, single mothers, former foster children, trauma counselors, stood in a circle holding hands while Natalie placed the first cornerstone plaque on the wall. It read, "Not adopted, restored, NC." The Foundation's mission was clear: fund emotional care training across public systems, create emergency support teams for children in silent distress, build a national registry of non-biological caregivers entitled to legal recognition, preserve stories of unrecognized love. Natalie refused to serve as its face. She appointed a board of women who had been ignored most of their lives, women like her. She said, "I was never the exception. I was just the first one someone finally noticed." Jonathan renounced the last of the winter's fortunes shortly after. Instead of legacy wealth, he channeled the remaining funds into a listening fellowship, one that would train social workers, foster parents, and school counselors on how to identify trauma without needing a scream. Rachel donated her name, not as power but as apology. She helped pass legislation in her father's home state that permanently banned sealed cases involving emotional coercion in child services. And Grant Bennett, he vanished from public life. No trial, no legacy, just silence. But this time the silence belonged to the truth. Liam, now nearly 2, learned to walk between pillars of reform. But the most important step he ever took came quietly. One evening, Natalie was rocking him on the porch of the cabin. He had just finished his warm milk. The sun was setting in soft orange behind the pines. She hummed the lullaby, as always. Liam rested his head on her chest. And then, out of nowhere, he whispered, "Mom, just once, not loud, not dramatic, just true." Natalie froze. Her arms tightened around him. She kissed the top of his head. She didn't cry, because this wasn't grief. This was home. Later she would stitch that word, Mom, into the lining of his coat, just above the old one, Mother of Record, Natalie Amelia Carter. Because in the end, it wasn't a system that gave her that title. It wasn't a courtroom. It wasn't even the government. It was a child who cried and was finally heard. She was never given a title, a legacy, or a name that carried weight. But she had something the world constantly underestimated: the ability to listen. She heard a baby's cry when everyone else had gone silent. She listened to the grief in forgotten lullabies, and in doing so, she saved not just a child, but a family, a law, a nation. Because sometimes the strongest love is the quietest one. If this story touched your heart, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments, where are you listening from? Your support is what keeps stories like this alive.